Dear students, I welcome you all to this lecture on precariousness and informality in South Asian labor markets. The lecture would be dealing with various aspects of informalization in general and will particularly focus on the pattern and characteristics of precariousness and informality in South Asian labor markets. Dear students, a large number of economies in the developing world and the global south are informal in nature, resulting in the creation of a large section of low productive, low and semi-skilled workforce having volatile incomes and surviving without any social security. According to the International Labour Organization, more than 60% of the world's employed population are in informal economy, and most of them are located in emerging and developing countries. The informal economy plays a major role in employment creation, income generation and production in many countries, contributing 75% and more of non-agricultural employment in some developing countries. In India, for example, in terms of employment, the informal economy, which makes use of casual and subcontracted workers, dominates and accounts for more than 75% of manufacturing employment. Many are self-employed while others work in informal enterprises or informal positions at formal enterprises, such as through subcontracting or temporary agencies. They are deprived of basic legal and social protections. Dear students, the large size of informal economy is a major obstacle to poverty alleviation and makes the achievement of decent work for all a distant dream. Workers in unprotected and precarious employment conditions are vulnerable and insecure, and most often choose to work informally out of necessity. The informal economy is also very heterogeneous, consisting of self-employed and wage workers, as well as intermediate categories such as industrial outworkers and unpaid contributing family members who most often happen to be women. The main aim of this lecture is to explain informalization in South Asia, its main characteristics, causes and consequences for economic development in the region. The lecture is structured as: in the first part, key concepts such as informal sector, informal wage employment and informal economy are discussed. It then turns to explaining the informalization in South Asia. Dear students, let's know about terminology associated with informality. Informal sector: all economic activities by workers or economic units that are in law or practice not covered or sufficiently covered by formal arrangements. Informal wage employment: all employee jobs characterized by employment relationship that's not subject to national labor legislation, income taxation, social protection to certain employment benefits. Informal economy: the informal sector and its workers plus the informal workers in the formal sector constitute the informal economy. The term informal sector was coined in Africa in the early 1970s by the British anthropologist Keith Hart and the International Labour Organization to refer to the urban self-employed. The International Labour Organization initially used informal to define undocumented and unregulated activities largely performed as self-employment. Recently, informality has come to characterize unprotected occupations in a broader sense, or jobs lacking security and social provisions, even when performed within a legally formal sector or in a subordinate relationship towards the certified enterprises. According to Martha Chen, the informalization of the labor market represents a situation in which the ratio of informal labor force to the formal labor force or the share of informal labor force in the total labor force increases over time. Broadly speaking, the informal sector comprises all economic activity that remains outside the official institutional framework. The informal labor market consists of workers in the informal sector plus casual workers in the formal sector. The informal labor market is a very large part of the agriculture sector, but is also a significant part of the urban sector. Informalization of the workforce can occur through self-employment, wage work in the enterprises in both the formal and informal sectors, or home-based work. Very broadly, informal employment is understood as work that lacks adequate social protection such as a specified minimum wage, health insurance, a pension scheme, paid holidays, job security, paid maternity leave, paid sick leave, family allowances, unemployment benefits, and insurance against sudden loss of income. Other features linked to working conditions are long hours and unhealthy and unsafe work environment and lack of protection against extreme weather conditions. There is a difference between employment in the formal sector and the informal sector in terms of the conditions of the work, whether workers are subject to government taxes, have access to social security or insurance, are casual or contract workers, and whether or not they receive the minimum wages. In recent years, informal wage employment is associated with decline in formal wage employment and the informalization of once formal jobs. Informalization is due in large measure to the hiring practices of the employers who opt to retain a small core regular workforce and hire other workers on an informal basis in order to avoid payroll taxes, social security contributions or pensions or other obligations as employers. In this lecture, we will use the term informal sector to refer to employment in informal enterprises and the terms informal employment or informal economy to refer to the wider notion of informality that also includes informal employment outside the informal sector. Now the question arises that who is likely to be an informal worker and a part of the informal economy. Research shows that the level of education is strongly related to whether one is a formal or informal sector worker. As the level of education increases, the level of informality decreases. People who have completed secondary and tertiary education are less likely to be in the informal employment compared to workers who have either no education. The level of education is a key factor in facilitating the transition from informal to formal employment. People living in rural areas are more likely to be in informal employment compared to those in urban areas. Agriculture is the sector with highest level of informal employment, estimated at more than 90%. In rural areas, the informal economy sustains livelihoods of impoverished populations through natural resource and land-based economic activities such as farming, logging and mining. There is an important relationship between poverty and informality, as the incidence of poverty is higher in informal sector than in the formal sector. While not all informal workers are poor, poverty is both a cause and as a consequence of informality. The poor face higher rates of informal employment and the poverty rates are higher among workers in informal employment. A strategy to reduce poverty should be to increase productivity and wage levels in informal sector through improving education, working experience and capital access for informal employees. The prevalence of informal work is also associated with high inequality. Workers with similar skills tend to earn less in the informal sector than their formal sector peers, and the wage gap between formal and informal workers is higher at lower skill levels. The precarious nature of informal work tends to accentuate both poverty and inequality amongst the population. Informalization also has a gendered nature, with differential earnings, choices, and locations of activities, level of competition, and time allocated to work having significant implications for women, especially young women. Informal work has been linked with gender inequality as women have increasingly turned to informal employment sectors. In low and lower middle income countries, 2 out of 3 women are more likely than men not only to be in informal employment but also to be in the most precarious and low paying categories of informal employment. Dear students, now I will talk about the case of South Asia. In South Asia, the vast majority of labor force is employed in the informal economy. South Asia is one of the regions of the world with highest average incidence of informal employment. The agriculture sector and the informal mode of employment in the secondary and tertiary sector of the economy account for a major share in total employment in the South Asian region. The formal sector employment, having some form of rules and regulations governing employment, is pitiably small. Labor markets in South Asia have been characterized as dualistic, with a relatively small, well-protected formal sector and a large, unprotected informal sector. As per estimates, this duality is to the tune of 90% informal sector and 10% formal sector. A report published by ILO in 2018, Women and Men in Informal Economy, a Statistical Picture, says that close to 88% of all employed persons in India make a living by working in the informal sector. Among the 5 South Asian countries, informalization of labor is highest in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. As can be seen from the data presented in Table 1, compiled from the ILO report for different South Asian countries, the informal employment comprised 89% of the total employment in Bangladesh, 88% in India, and 82.4% in Pakistan. Again, there is a heavy share of informal employment in the total non-agriculture employment in the region. As is clear from the table, almost all countries in South Asia region show a heavy reliance on informal sector, which suggests a high level of income and employment insecurity in region. This study also found a growing number of youth aged between 15 to 24 who are in the informal employment in the Asian region, compared with 67.1% of adult workers. The report states the higher the education level, the higher the chance to obtain formal employment. 31% of tertiary educated workers are in informal employment compared to 90% of workers with primary education. Calling for measures to tackle informality, a key marker of region's socio-economic development, the report noted that such jobs are predominant in rural areas and formed almost half of employment in urban areas. It is also important to note that the low labor force participation rates are mainly attributed to differences in rates between genders. According to ILO, while the region's total labor force participation rate was 56.1% in 2012, it was 80.6% for men but only 30.4% for women. Such statistics demonstrate that the women are more likely than men to engage in uncompensated work at home, which is a form of vulnerable employment, since women's autonomy within a household or community is lessened by their lack of independent income sources. Dear students, the last 2 decades have seen high rates of informalization of labor, propelled by the race towards flexible regimes in the global south to attract foreign capital, leading to creation of large swaths of low wage and semi-skilled labor working in the absence of decent working conditions under highly precarious and exploitative work conditions. In India, despite high levels of economic growth during the past 2 decades, the informal or unorganized labor employment has persisted over the years. More than 90% of the total workforce and about 50% of the national product are accounted by the informal economy. A high proportion of socially and economically underprivileged sections of the society are concentrated in the informal economic activities. In India, the unorganized sector is dominated by a huge number of self-employed as well as hired labor without any social security benefits and safety nets. Dear students, the factors responsible for increasing informalization of workforce in South Asia. There are various explanations for the large unprotected informal sector in the South Asia. The State of Working India report by Azim Premji University points to the lack of formal education and other barriers to entry in the formal sector as the reasons for increase in the informal workers in the organized services and manufacturing sectors. Factors such as labor market rigidities, poor skill levels and increasing competition from imports are seen as inducing creation of informal employment and decline of formal employment opportunities. The public sector, public enterprises and many large private firms are downsizing employment, are outsourcing production, leading to new entrants into informal self-employment and the informalization of once formal jobs. When enterprises are downsized or shut down, the workers who are laid off and cannot find alternative formal jobs often end up working in the informal economy. This is particularly true of those who cannot afford to be unemployed, more so in countries without unemployment insurance or compensation. Globalization of the economy is regarded as having contributed to the informalization of the workforce as it has led to unemployment and inequality in the income distribution. In response to global competition, formal firms tend to hire all but a few core workers under informal arrangements or to outsource the production of goods and services to other firms and countries. The growing level of informal employment in the formal sector is largely due to the growing use of contract labor and outsourcing of production. In South Asia and other developing regions, globalization has been associated with two modes of production that provide little job security or legal protection to workers: concentrated production in large factories or workshops in export processing zones, and dispersed production across a long chain of suppliers, contractors, and industrial outworkers in the global supply chains. To attract foreign investors and increase exports, many South Asian countries have created industrial enclaves of export-oriented factories called export processing zones. Most of these zones are exempted from national labor legislation and thus are associated with high degrees of informal employment, including self-employment, informal wage employment, and industrial outwork. Informality is found in both the traditional informal economy and increasingly through the growth of informality in the formal sector. Labor regulations in more than one have implicitly supported this informalization or contractualization of the workforce. In older capitalist countries and emerging economies alike, the expansion of informal employment is crucially shaped by outsourcing and casualization in established companies, which explains the conceptual convergence of informality and precariousness. Precarious employment is often an integral part of the development strategies of states and international financial institutions. Limited employment creation in the formal economy means that for many people, the only alternative is to seek employment in the informal economy. Lastly, dear students, I will discuss about the need for social protection. International Labour Organization defines social protection as the set of public measures that a society provides for its members to protect them against economic and social distress that would be caused by the absence or a substantial reduction of income from work as a result of various contingencies such as sickness, maternity, employment injury, unemployment, invalidity, old age, and the death of the breadwinner, the provision of health care, and the provision of benefits for families with children. Informal work tends to be less productive, relies on less skilled labor inputs, and offers fewer opportunities for skill accumulation. Informality is also closely associated with poverty. Most workers in the informal economy in South Asia do not have access to social protection. In order to reduce their vulnerability, improve income security and healthcare access, it is important that the governments expand social protection security coverage to informal workers. Social security systems ensure the minimum level of living to the needy by public assistance, and they also promote public health and social welfare. Social security coverage rate in India is limited, and the coverage among socially disadvantaged sections is very low. India being a social democratic republic, it is the duty of the state to provide for social security schemes. Social security in India would require minimum employment, health insurance, maternity insurance, pension, and life insurance. The National Social Assistance Program, launched in August 1995, marks a significant step towards providing social security coverage in India. The NSAP has three components: National Old Age Pension Scheme, National Family Benefit Scheme, and National Maternity Benefit Scheme. In India, the major social security schemes are meant for the employers of organized sector only. India has undertaken a number of initiatives for the welfare of unorganized workers. These include targeted schemes for promotion of micro, small and medium enterprises, and legislative measures such as the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act, Contract Labour Abolition and Regulation Act, and Workers' Welfare Boards. However, the coverage of social security schemes in India is very limited and extremely sparse among the economically and socially vulnerable sections. While concluding this lecture, it is important to emphasize that due to increased competition exercised by liberalization, privatization, and globalization, developing as well as developed countries have witnessed a significant decline in formal employment and increase in informal employment, due to which social security coverage has decreased. The need for flexible labor markets as demanded by structural adjustments programs in neoliberal economies exacerbate the precarity entailed in informalization and push the labor force to the margins of bare sustenance. Informalization has been accompanied by an increase in worker insecurity and poverty. A holistic approach is needed to address the issue of informalization. Economic growth alone is insufficient to eradicate poverty, and therefore state intervention is necessary to eradicate inequality through equitable distribution of income. COVID-19 has further worsened the situation as casual or temporary wage workers lost jobs. According to ActionAid India, up to 80% of the informal sector workers in India lost their jobs as the lockdown progressed. A recent report titled State of Working India 2021 by Azim Premji University shows that the pandemic has further increased informality and led to a severe decline in the earnings for majority of the workers, resulting in a sudden increase in poverty. The repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic call for rapid and effective measures to enhance income security for workers in the informal economy, especially for women with young children, a group at the highest risk of economic hardship. It also serves as a reminder for the crucial need for the creation of jobs in formal sector, labor reforms, and equitable distribution of income. Finally, the governments in South Asia should facilitate the transition of the informal economy to the formal economy and ensure proper safety nets and social security provisions for the workforce. Dear students, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.